Alrighty, well, we're going to go ahead and get started. And first of all, I love seeing everybody putting their name and location in the chat. I see folks are tuning in from all across the state, from Chagrin Falls and Cincinnati, Columbus, Toledo. We're just so happy to have everybody here with us this evening and for tonight's program. To start, my name is Collin Marozzi. I am the Deputy Policy Director for the ACLU of Ohio, and I'm going to be moderating tonight's panel. Thank you all for joining us this evening, and I hope everybody had a very enjoyable Labor Day holiday. But as you know, since we're now past Labor Day, election season is upon us, and November is going to be here before you know it. We're officially 61 days away from Election Day, and as the old cliche goes, Ohio's future will be on the ballot this November. And Ohioans are starting to see that with ads starting to flood our TV screens, our iPhones, and our radio. So we know that a lot of races like the governor and U.S. Senate will get a lot of attention in the next coming weeks and months. But we're here today because we wanted to talk to you all about some of the lesser talked about races, elections, and issues that are going to be on our November ballot. Namely, we're going to be discussing the elections for the Ohio Supreme Court, the State Board of Education, and a ballot measure that is going to change how cash bail is used in our pretrial legal system. Now, don't be fooled. Simply because these issues don't get talked about doesn't mean that they don't matter. And what we're going to get into tonight is that these elections and issues have huge implications on the future of Ohio. And I am so excited to have such an amazing panel with us of experts and advocates to talk us through these issues. I'm going to introduce our panelists, starting with Akii Butler, organizer from the Ohio Student Association. Akii is OSA's organizer in Columbus and Kent State University. Before joining OSA, Akii was a student organizer at Kent State, as well as with another local organization. At OSA, Akii hopes to bring together unique and emerging students to help make the change that they want to see. He wants to bring about change within the higher education system with the help of his peers and colleagues. Thanks so much for being here, Akii.
Thank you so much for having me.
Next, we have Cynthia Peeples, founding director of the Honesty for Ohio Education Coalition. The Honesty for Ohio Education Coalition is a nonpartisan statewide group that believes every child deserves an honest education grounded in truth, facts, and diverse perspectives. In her role, Cynthia advocates for an honest education at the Ohio State House, the Ohio State Board of Education, and our local schools. She also is on the state board of the League of Women Voters of Ohio. She leads the League's Northeast Ohio Real Talk program and co-chairs the Akron NAACP Act So program. Cynthia transitioned to nonprofit service while working as a news reporter and anchor in Texas, marrying her passion for storytelling and advocacy. Always a pleasure to have you, Cynthia. Thank you for being here. And finally, we have my colleague, Patrick Higgins, policy counsel with the ACLU of Ohio. In his role with the ACLU, Patrick combines his legal training and love for good policy to advocate for impactful changes at the state and local levels. Patrick primarily works on issues related to the ACLU's Campaign for Smart Justice, which is a multi-year effort to reduce the U.S. Jail and prison population and combat racial disparities in our criminal legal system. Patrick enjoys learning from and working with a dedicated team of advocates and community members to advance the mission of the ACLU of Ohio. Patrick, don't hold it against me. I mispronounced your last name. We'll talk about it at the staff meeting. Welcome to all of our panelists, and thank you so much for being with us here tonight. Now, before we dig into tonight's program, I wanted to make sure the audience knows how to engage the panel this evening. So if you have any questions that you would like our panelists to answer, please, if you're watching on Zoom, go ahead and use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom browser. And if you're listening on Facebook Live, drop your questions in the comments. We have folks that are going to be screening questions that will be posed to the panelists at the end of tonight's program. Again, we are urging those on Zoom to use the Q&A function and not the chat. And also, we again have closed captioning services available if you would like. Please, those are located at the bottom of your Zoom browser as well. So now to the fun stuff. And Akii, let's start with you. So we all know that the races for governor and for U.S. Senate will have major implications on the future of Ohio, but you're here today to talk about the Ohio Supreme Court elections this November and why they are just as important. So can you talk to us a little bit about why these Supreme Court elections are just so critical?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, like the Supreme Court races are honestly like, I want to say maybe the most critical out of all the races, because the way I look at the Supreme Court is it's sort of as our last line of defense when it comes to our rights and protecting our rights. So when I think about the Supreme Court, I think about these races, it's very important that you get into it, tune in, see what's going on, see the candidates that are running, and then also get out and vote. So that way you know that you did your best. So when it comes to the Supreme Court, we're going to do a little bit of sort of like an overall thing, talking about what the Supreme Court is, what it looks like, all that fun jazz. And so, as some of us know, maybe, and as some who don't know, in Article 4, Section 2 of the Constitution, it sets the size of the court at 7, which is one chief justice and then 6 other justices. They are elected, they are elected to 6-year terms on a nonpartisan ballot. 2 justices are chosen at the general election in even number years. In the year when a chief justice runs, voters must pick 3 members of the court. This year, however, for our Supreme Court race is a bit different, because for the first time, it will be a partisan ballot instead of a nonpartisan ballot, due to a bill that was signed by Governor DeWine, Senate Bill 80, which makes partisan elections for the Supreme Court and the appellate court races. So yeah, this is something a bit different. Normally, you would just go in and you would see the names, do things that way. Now, for the first time, people are actually going to go into the ballots and see whether it's a Republican or Democratic next to the justices that are running for the Supreme Court. And we can go right ahead to the next slide. Yes. So, and as I stated before, it is an even year, and this is a year where the Chief Justice runs. So we have sort of 3 seats up for grabs. Currently, the races that we're seeing is Justice Brunner and Justice Kennedy. Brunner is, of course, on the Democratic platform, Kennedy on the Republican platform, and they are sort of running for the Chief Justice position. Then you have the other candidates that are running, which is Pat Fisher, Republican, Terry Jamison, Democratic, Pat DeWine, Republican, and Marilyn Zayas, Democratic. And yes, you may recognize that last name. It's a fun time here in the Ohio Supreme Court. So these are the current races that are going on, and I would say, suggest that everybody looking at this do some research on their candidates to see, what the candidates are about, what their experience is, because this really determines, as you said before, the future of Ohio. And we can head to the next slide. So, as I said before, Supreme Court is sort of the last resort in Ohio. And most of its cases are like the appeals from the 12 district courts of appeals. Sorry, I'm getting a little tongue-tied. And the court may grant leave to appeal felony cases from the courts of appeals. It may direct the Court of Appeals to certify its record in any civil or misdemeanor cases that the court finds to be of public or great general interest. Basically, I say all that to say is basically the Supreme Court normally takes the cases that everybody wants to know the answer to. Everybody's interested in what the Supreme Court's decision is. It is definitely a big interest to everybody around because it normally affects all Ohioans. So they normally hear those cases. Like I said, most of its cases will be appeals, but every now and then you may get a case that may be something of huge interest, which we have been seeing a lot recently with not just nationally, but also within our state of Ohio. You can go right to the next slide.
Well, Akii, actually, as you brought up, as you started your segment, you talked about how can be like, the last stop, the last stand to protect our civil rights. And, a lot of attention has shifted to the question of abortion access following, the United States Supreme Court overturning the landmark Roe v. Wade case, which, among other things, established Americans' right to privacy, including access to abortion care. So can you talk a little bit more about how the future Ohio Supreme Court will act as kind of that final backstop against a General Assembly that is extremely conservative and seems hell-bent on ending any and all abortion access in the state of Ohio?
Absolutely. So when I think about that quick question and I think about everything that's going on, we do know that here in Ohio, that once Roe v. Wade was overturned, and things were kicked back to the state level, Ohio passed the heartbeat bill. The reason why the heartbeat bill was not passed when it was first introduced was because folks were able to argue, due to Roe v. Wade sort of setting precedent, that, you can't necessarily, ban something that's like nationally, has set the precedent. Well, once that got overturned, that sort of squandered that. And basically was like, well, now we can pass sort of like this heartbeat bill. So when I think about that, and I think about the different things that are at stake, many of the cases that we may be seeing in the coming time, in the future, in the very near future, actually, will definitely be affected. I feel like they will definitely be what the world is looking to see, especially Ohioans, being especially in Ohio. They will be looking to see what the court is going to do and how they're going to react. We've already seen that they have immediately said, hey, well, we no longer have Roe v. Wade as the precedent, so this could just go through, and that won't be the only thing that will be affected. Abortion and reproductive access, reproductive rights are something that are definitely will be under attack. And if we have a court that doesn't necessarily believe in, reproductive rights, more often than not, it's going to be a good chance that abortion rights or reproductive rights will definitely be under attack or honestly banned outright. And that's not going to be the only case that's going to be banned outright. Because when you think about it, the landmark cases that sort of set a certain precedent and were protected, now they're all at stake. And we know that Justice Clarence Thomas from the National Court wrote that we should reconsider all of his court, reconsider all cases that deal with substantive due process precedents, and that include like the Griswold, Lawrence, and Obergefell. Sorry, I'm getting tongue-tied today. But these are all cases that deal with an American's fundamental rights to privacy, due process, and equal protections. So things that we know, such as marriage equality, right to contraceptive, different things like that, those will all be under attack. And it's sort of like, what can we do to sort of protect that? How do we make sure that our court is something that actually represents Ohioans and that they fight for Ohioans? The best way to do that is to sort of go out there and vote. And it's a kind of a funny story because many people actually don't know that we actually vote for our state Supreme Court. I talked to a couple of friends and they was like, oh, I didn't even know we voted for those. I was like, yes, we do. We actually do vote for the state Supreme Court. We don't vote for the national one, but we do vote for this one. So yeah, I would say people should be very vigilant on things to come. And when I think about that, I also think about redistricting. Everybody knows that Ohio's redistricting has been a hot mess. I would be lying if I said it was super easy. And the Supreme Court has acted as that last resort of protecting the rights. They have shut down those maps many times, more than 3 times, more than 4. And we know that they are upholding the constitutional right to us to have a fair and transparent process when it comes to redistricting. If we don't have a court that represents that and doesn't uphold what the Constitution has, that could be very dangerous. Ohioans won't be represented how they should be. And we have different things that will be affected. Not only will our like sort of, legislative and congressional districts be affected, but then and I know Cynthia's going to talk about this, but then We also have school districts and different things like that. Like those will also be affected. And so with the Supreme Court acting now as that sort of last resort in protecting and upholding the Constitution, folks need to know that this race is extremely important and that the different things that are happening here and the different things that will be at stake can change the livelihood for many of us within, like, honestly, months. Not just like years or in the future, but honestly months. That, like, it's so close.
Well, Akii, thank you so much. I love how you finished on redistricting. Redistricting is very important to me, in fair districts and fair maps and fair representation. It's such a bedrock principle to this state and this country. And, it's really the gatekeeping issue for politics and for the Ohio General Assembly. If there are rigged maps, that means that elections are much more difficult to hold your elected leaders accountable. So I think that is just so critically important when people are thinking about the Ohio Supreme Court elections. Redistricting is at the forefront, because without redistricting, without fair maps, you can't even get to protecting abortion care or protecting interracial or same-sex marriage or all those other critically important civil rights that you mentioned. So thank you very much for sharing that, and I think it just proves again how monumental these elections are. Just a reminder for folks, as we move throughout tonight's program, if you have questions and you're viewing on Zoom, please make sure to drop them into the Q&A, and we'll get to them at the end of the program. And same thing for those on Facebook Live. If you have questions, drop them in the comments. So Cynthia, turning to you, recently across the country, we've seen kind of this wave of politicizing our education system, coming from anywhere from deciding what can and can't be taught in schools, to banning books, to even firing teachers who don't comply with these educational gag orders. And I know the Honesty for Ohio Education Coalition it has been advocating to keep politics out of our classrooms. And as part of that, you are trying to get folks up to speed on what exactly goes on at our State Board of Education. So I guess, can you just start off with, kind of just talking about what the State Board is, what they do, and why should people care?
Yeah. Thank you so much for that, Collin. And first, before I begin, I definitely want to give a warm shout out to ACLU Ohio for inviting Honesty to this very important and timely discussion. And what I want to do first is introduce everyone to the coalition, for those of you that are not familiar, and really encourage you to get involved in the Honesty family and the Honesty Network. We are a nonpartisan statewide coalition. We work shoulder to shoulder with more than 40 organizational partners across the state and even nationally. ACLU Ohio, League of Women Voters Ohio, and Policy Matters Ohio were three of our core founding organizations. And I'm just so proud and honored to be sitting here in the ACLU house tonight. And as Collin said at the top of the program, we educate and advocate and build community around honest education and around affirming identities and protecting local control in education. We do that at those three lanes: State House, State Board, which I'm going to dive into in just a second, in our local schools. And one of the things I really want to lift and stress here is our Youth and Young Adult Coalition. We feel it is so important to center the student voice and student experience in all of these spaces in education, because it's our students and our educators who are on the front lines of this harm and these attacks, and having to maneuver in this space. And all of us in the adult world are really their ambassadors in their surrogates. So please consider getting involved. We need to create a unified front to protect our students and our educators. Okay, so let's go ahead and dive in to the State Board of Education. And like Collin said, we'll start off with kind of a primer of what the State Board does. And operationally, the State Board of Ed is an elected and an appointed executive body of the Ohio government, and they really lead the Ohio Department of Education. They help inform and guide all of the educational policies for Ohio's 612, imagine that, 612 school districts that serves nearly 1.7 million students in urban, suburban, ex-urban, and rural communities across the state of Ohio. Now, that board is made up of 19 members. Those are 11 elected and 8 appointed by the governor. And each one of our State Board of Ed districts, interestingly, and we're going to come back to this later, is comprised of 3 contiguous meaning touching, state Senate districts, hint, hint, redistricting, like I said, which is going to be important later on. And each one of those members can serve up to 2 consecutive 4-year terms, which is important when we talk about the elections. Now, why do we care about the state board other than they administer really what happens for the DOE, shorthand for our Department of Education? Well, they help develop the state standards and the model curricula. They work in concert with the Department of Education to make sure that those state standards and model curricula reflect the needs and priorities of our students and our school districts and our communities. They also hire and or dismiss the superintendent of public education, which we know shorthand as the state superintendent, also very important right now. They also operationalize the legislative education policies and priorities that come out of the State House, which is why we need to work in partnership with our legislators. And finally, they also make personnel decisions about licensure for our educators, our staff, and our administration in our local school districts. Now, a really quick, easy way to plug in and engage with what the State Board of Education does on a daily and a monthly basis is attend those monthly board meetings. They have monthly board meetings on the second Monday and Tuesday of every month. They were just out on break for the month of August and will be reconvening here shortly on September 19th and 20th. Now, I should put an asterisk by that date because you'll look on the calendar and you'll see that that is actually the third Monday and Tuesday, but regularly they do meet every second Monday and Tuesday. So don't hold that against me. Okay, and public comment is also invited on those Tuesdays on that second day, which we also highly encourage folks to do. You can go live on site or you can submit your public comment in writing, and you can find all of the board material on the State Board of Education website. And you can also watch the meetings live. Please do that on the Ohio channel. The Ohio channel is a wonderful site where you can pull up archived meetings from all of our elected officials as well as the State Board of Education. Quick housekeeping note, all of the links that you, or all of the font that you see here on the screen is actually, the blue font is a hyperlink. So when you receive this deck later on, you can click on that to take a deeper dive into the information. And then our current priorities around the State Board of Education that we're following closely like a hawk is the onboarding of our new superintendent of public instruction. Stephen Dakin was recently appointed, but was in that seat for less than a month. So now we're on the hunt again for a new state superintendent, which the board works closely with, and the state superintendent administers and manages essentially the Department of Education. Very important role. We also want to make sure that our state board is staying true to the priorities of the strategic plan for the Department of Education. We have a 5-year strategic plan, as well as being sure to prioritize the whole child approach to education, which is really at the core, the center of our 5-year strategic plan for the DOE. And then finally, of course, why we're here, our main priority right now are the upcoming elections, because there are 5 State Board of Education districts that are on the ballot. That would be districts 2, 3, 4, 9, and 10. And we'll take a deeper dive into that in just a second. Here, I just wanted to quickly flash up. This is a beautiful infographic about the 5-year strategic plan for the Department of Education. Please, we'll be providing the links for this, but really dig into this. It really gives you a good sense of how the Department of Education is approaching a whole child framework for education. You see that whole child at the center, the 4 learning domains, the goals, the 3 core principles of our education, which leads with equity. The Department of Education took a lot of time to go around the state and engage with our districts and communities to understand what they need to infuse into this strategic plan. So this was a very thoughtful approach to education. If we jump ahead one more, you'll see the whole child framework here again, which centers the student, the family is wrapped around the student, and then building out those community partnerships. And you can see, you know, the priorities in green for the whole child approach to education there as well. Again, please dive into these after the program.
Well, and Cynthia, you know, first of all, thank you very much for sharing this information. You know, I'm sure a lot of people know, you know, that their local schools have school boards that help make these kind of decisions for their local communities. But, you know, a lot of people don't know that the state itself has a state board of education. So I commend you for trying to, you know, get that on people's radars and make sure they're paying attention. But I wanted to bring it back to kind of this, you know, this fervor of politicizing our education that we've seen across the country. And so how does Ohio State Board of Education play into this kind of politicizing our kids' classrooms and our education system? And has this trend already kind of made its way to Ohio?
Thank you for that question, Collin. And yes, it absolutely has. And that's a question that keeps many of us, including you, up late at night and has us rising at the crack of dawn and working shoulder to shoulder in the Honesty Coalition and even outside the coalition. Since January of 2021, take a look at this map, folks. 42 states across the country have introduced or passed legislation or actions at 3 different levels: state house, state boards of eds, and local school districts to censor honest education around race, sexuality, identity, and really having a full accounting for the legacy of racism, discrimination, homophobia, transphobia, anti-Semitism, xenophobia, and misogyny. These are all things that the ACLU wraps their arms around and tries to protect communities from. Now, what we all need to understand here is that this is a well-coordinated, well-funded national political agenda to weaponize race and identity in the classroom. This is forcing educators to hide the complexities and the trauma of our history and how each of us actually moves through the world differently. This agenda wants to move us away from understanding, from reconciliation, and from healing, and hold all of us hostage to this myopic, whitewashed, reductive view of the world. Now, these attacks against honest education, what's happening that we're seeing right now is it's causing this chilling effect on education and actually driving educators out of the profession. So we have a national crisis around teacher shortages, and here in Ohio as well. Now, what we really need to wrap our heads around here is that this agenda is a calculated way to distract from the real issues around education, especially here in Ohio, like our unconstitutional way that we fund our schools, like our under-resourced schools, and the overwhelming mental health crisis that our children and our students are facing as they struggle to transition out of the pandemic. And this is all neatly couched and packaged in a manufactured crisis around critical race theory and a growing Christian nationalism movement that is steeped in homophobia, transphobia, and racism. And we have to remember that our Black community, our brown communities, my Asian brothers and sisters, and Indigenous communities have all been teaching about the realities of our heritage and our culture for centuries. And we didn't call them divisive concepts as our legislators are doing now. These stories and experience, the African diaspora, they aren't new. It's only after the turbulent revolutionary summer of 2020 around the murder of George Floyd and the countless other beautiful Black fathers, brothers, sisters, aunties, and uncles that those realities and that history has actually landed wholesale into our white suburban school districts. Teachers and students are demanding to learn about the truth of who we are and where we've been, because during 2020, they couldn't look away from it. Those realities were in their face. They couldn't look away from the systemic inequities, the disparities, and the subjugation anymore. And that push for truth and accountability struck fear and panic into those that hold unbalanced legislative and political power, and actually triggered a massive backlash and ushered in this manufactured crisis around critical race theory in our schools and what you see here today. So, Collin, my slides disappeared.
Yeah, we appear to be having a little bit of technical difficulty, so I'm going to try to get the screen share back. Let's see here. Okay, sorry about that.
No.
I believe everybody should be able to see the slides again, though.
Okay, and we can jump to the next slide.
Okay.
Great. Okay, so jumping ahead to State Board of Elections and gerrymandering of public education. So now we're going to look at the elections, and here on the screen you see the 5 districts that will be on the ballot, and the names that you see right now are the current board members. Now, talking about the State Board of Education district map that's being used for the elections, we need to kind of understand the story of how we got this map. So by law, Ohio must redraw State Board of Education district boundaries after state legislative redistricting is complete, and many people don't realize that. Now, this was complicated by the nightmare of a redistricting process that Akii was talking about, that we've all been living through since last year. And because of that delayed process, Governor DeWine was required to designate new State Board of Ed districts, which he did with a letter of designation back in January of this year. And at the time, he had to use the second set of state maps that were in play at the time, which have since been discarded by the Ohio Supreme Court. Now, when you redraw State Board of Ed districts, there are really 4 requirements for that. So each district must contain 3 contiguous Senate districts, and they have to be based off of the most recent apportionment, and those districts cannot be split. And each of those board districts must be as compact as practicable. And some of those districts should primarily contain rural areas as well as urban districts. Now, after Governor DeWine released that letter of designation and the new State Board of Ed map, Honesty quickly contested that map because it was a clear attempt to gerrymander 4 state board members out of their seat. It was clear political retribution for their votes to not repeal the board's anti-racism and equity resolution, which we'll talk about in just a second, and really targeting them for prioritizing honest education and educational equity at the state board. Now, Governor DeWine's new map, in fact, what it did was it targeted 4 board members, and 2 of those board members were representing densely urban districts, housing some of the most diverse and marginalized students in the state. And when he redrew that map, he actually infused those districts with several rural districts, essentially overwhelming and drowning out that important urban voice and that urban vote. And those districts really centered Franklin counties and Cuyahoga counties. Now, the next board member that he was targeting, he actually removed her home county from her district. Why would he do that? Well, her home county, Medina County, talking about Dr. Christina Collins, was a county where she enjoyed quite a bit of success in her election. That county overwhelmingly voted for her. And then looking at our 4th board member that he targeted, he really, and this is for Michelle Newman, just took her district and just pulled it out and created this sprawling district which really violated requirements for compactness. So this was back in January and February. Fast forward to where we are now, when we have been forced to use map 3, unconstitutional map 3, we were all expecting Governor DeWine, of course, to reconfigure the map using the current Senate district map and not use a discarded Senate district map. To our utter disappointment and outrage, Governor DeWine did not reconfigure the state board map, which ended up creating a lot of many more indisputable violations of state law. We made several attempts to contact Governor DeWine to bring those maps into compliance, including a letter that we sent to Governor DeWine and Secretary LaRose, clearly outlining those issues. Both the governor and secretary abdicated responsibility, claiming that they were following the direction of the other. So now we're left with this unconstitutional, illegal, gerrymandered State Board of Education district map for the 2022 election. And that's what you see there on the screen. And we've circled the districts that are actually in play on the ballot in November. So jumping ahead, let's unpack the anti-racism resolution, which really was a trigger for all of this. So the resolution to condemn racism and advance equity and opportunity for Black students, Indigenous students, and students of color was drafted in the summer of 2020 and passed in July by a 12-5 vote. Now, in October, in October of 2021, after several attempts to delegitimize and really dismantle this resolution, the board ended up voting to repeal this resolution, this very essential framework. And you can see what the resolution actually addressed there over on the right-hand side. But they repealed this resolution by a 10-7 vote. And this just sent a devastating message to our Black and Brown, our Indigenous, our AAPI communities, that the board was not willing to prioritize some very systemic issues in education and in the state of Ohio, impacting how they learn and grow in their school districts. Here's where this gets worse. Quickly after the board voted to repeal the anti-racism and equity resolution, Governor DeWine quickly asked then President Laura Kohler to resign because she was one of the people that voted not to repeal the resolution. And then he also asked another appointed member to resign because he refused to repeal the anti-racism and equity resolution. What's very important to note here is that President Laura Kohler was one of the core architects of drafting this resolution back in the summer of 2020. Now, to pull this forward to the gerrymandered map, this is where Governor DeWine was able to clean the rest of the House of the other board members who voted not to repeal the resolution. And those would be those 4 board members that we just talked about on a previous screen. So this is a lot to absorb, but it's really important that you understand the context of why, yes, we have another gerrymandered map in the state of Ohio, and you need to understand that there's a lot of politicization as far as our education system goes, and it really hits on all 3 levels, our state house, our state board of education, and our local districts. And we all have to pay attention to these races and vote.
Well, Cynthia, I can't thank you enough for raising, these issues. I mean, I know we're in this work every day, but when you sit back and you lay it all out, it's really incredible kind of the depths that have gone on to, kind of manipulate and tamper with children having, a welcoming, honest educational environment. And as the, child of 2 public school teachers, I think it's just a tragedy of what is being attempted to be done. So I want to thank you again so much for working so tirelessly on making sure voters across the state know these issues are happening. They're happening right now. So I think they're incredibly important, and the consequences and ramifications, as you just showed us, are real, and they are something that every voter should have on their mind. So next I want to turn to my colleague, Patrick Higgins. Patrick, Ohio voters are going to be asked to amend the Ohio Constitution this November. We're going to have 2 separate issues posed. Both of them originated in the General Assembly, and frankly, they were proposed and passed in pretty short order. So issue 1 has to do with changing the way cash bail is used in the state of Ohio in our pretrial legal system. Can you talk first off about kind of the background to issue 1, how it came about, and why the Ohio General Assembly seems so eager to cement the use of cash bail in our Constitution?
Yes, for sure. And happy to be here and talk to anyone who's willing to listen about bail reform in the state of Ohio. So for those of you who can see the slide that's up on the screen now, you see there it says issue 1 and then in quotation marks bail reform. And that's because I don't believe for a second that issue 1 is a bail reform measure. But before we dive into that any further, I want to start with just a little bit of background, if we can jump to the next slide, about what bail actually is. And so when we talk about bail, we commonly think, I think just as a general public, that bail refers to that amount of money that a person pays to get out of jail. But legally speaking, and I'm sorry that I'm the tail end of this as the lawyer and policy wonk, who's much less exciting than the other folks who went before me. But there's a distinction there, and bail is the process of releasing someone from jail. It doesn't have to include money. It can be conditions or other things. So as you'll see there, we do confuse it sometimes as a public with cash bail. But traditionally speaking, legally speaking, constitutionally speaking, bail, when it comes to cash bail, its only use is for a person to incentivize them to come back to court. Won't bore you with many details as far as data goes, but an important one is that there's no evidence that financial conditions for release are the most effective way to get people back to court. We have better tools like sending people text messages, making sure they have the means to actually get back to court, which is really the root of a lot of this altogether. So let's jump to a little bit more context here, and that is just a little bit more information about how bail works in Ohio. So in a lot of counties around the state, courts rely on something called a bond schedule, which is a predetermined list that sets an amount of money that a person can pay based on the crime that they're accused of committing. So they can post that amount, they get to go home. And that's problematic for a few reasons. One, people who are in jail pre-trial or during this process are legally innocent. They haven't yet been convicted of that crime. They're presumed innocent. And that's an important distinction. The other important thing is that this creates a system that we call based detention. Do you have the amount of money that you need to go home, or do you not? It's not, say Collin and I both committed the same crime tonight. We're both pose the same amount of risk to the community, but Collin makes a lot more money than I do. So Collin can pay for his release and I cannot. That is not a fair system. And it affects the people who you'd suspect, the most heavily the way every part of our criminal legal system does. It affects our Black neighbors, our brown neighbors, our low-income neighbors, who are already shouldering the brunt of our criminal legal system. And so a little bit more background, then I promise I'll move on to your actual question, which is that on any given day in Ohio, there's as many as 12,000 people who are in our state jails simply because 12,000 are there pre-trial, and many of whom are there simply because they can't afford the amount of cash that they need to post to get out of jail. We know that a lot of the folks that are there for non-person crimes, which means there wasn't a human victim, things like drug possession and the like. Tail end there. We know who's bearing the brunt of this. So where did this actually come from? Where are its origins? You'll see there that first green dot on our timeline dating back to May of last year is the introduction of legislation that I haven't yet talked about. I'm going to leave that out for right now, but know that there is alternate legislation out there that is actual true bail reform that's been sitting in our legislature since May of 2021 after years and years of work backed by a bipartisan coalition. But that's a good endpoint for us to start with. So that's been sitting in our legislature, again, over a year. Now comes January of 2021. Our state Supreme Court that you already heard about today makes really important decisions affecting all of our day-to-day lives, issues a decision in a case called DuBose v. McGuffey. And what that decision said was, hey, courts, we are not going to use cash bail as a means for public safety. And so what it did was it acknowledged a few things. One, the practice that many courts have fallen into, which is that, hey, in the name of public safety, we're going to set this person's bail amount so high that they could never achieve their release. What the court said was, hey, wait a second, and thinking back to that point I made earlier, the purpose of cash bail is only to secure the return of the person for their trial date. It's not to punish them. It's not to keep them locked up, because we do have a mechanism in our state law that allows courts and prosecutors to say, I want this person to sit in jail without bail. But as is often the case with a number of our laws and practices, that's not how it pans out. We've got this other, kind of practice that's become accepted by our communities, which is set cash bail so high a person could never get out. And so that was, and again, to make that distinction of how important our state Supreme Court is, split decision where the chief sided with the more liberal justices, which, for lack of a better word, ticked a few people off. And among those was a dissent from Justice Pat DeWine, who said, this will make us less safe. this is putting people at risk by prohibiting courts from using cash bail as this proxy for public safety. And so that was the beginning of the discussion that eventually led to issue 1, as you're going to see it on the ballot in November. And so, again, keeping in mind this timeline of May 2021 of, good bail reform legislation sitting in the legislature ready to be passed, we see the introduction of HJR2, House Joint Resolution 2, which is the precursor to issue 1, in March of 2022. And you'll see there in this timeline, I don't need to go through all those points individually to see how quickly it was fast-tracked while other bail reform legislation sat in the General Assembly. And so as folks who are familiar with our legislature are already aware, but for those of you who might not be, laws can take a long time to work their way through our General Assembly. Issue 1 in its initial form of House Joint Resolution 2 was fast-tracked and really sent quickly through the legislature over the outcry of folks opposing it. And the reason that happened, and this should be your takeaway from, if there's any takeaway from my portion of this talk tonight, is that this puts politics in the way of good policy. And so I've identified on this slide the folks who were backing House Joint Resolution 2 and its companion bill, Senate Joint Resolution 5 in our legislature. You'll see them there. Chairman of the House Criminal Justice Committee, LaRae, DJ Swearingen, Representative Swearingen, who sits on that committee as well, Senator Teresa Gavarone, who sits on Senate Judiciary, Prosecutor Joe Dieters from Hamilton County, and State Attorney General Dave Yost. One thing you'll notice about that is a distinction from that other point I made about the alternative bail legislation, which is that alternative bail legislation, which I'll jump to in just a bit, is bipartisan, broadly supported. These folks all are part of the same party. And I think this brings us to a nice kind of bow to tie up here, which is that this is politics over policy. And what this is going to do is it's going to put this issue 1 that you'll see on your screen with a lot of text that I promise not to read on the ballot in November. And what that will do is 2 kind of primary things. The first is that it's going to require that courts in Ohio consider public safety when setting the cash bail amount. And the reason that we see that as problematic is for that primary constitutional reason I talked about before. The purpose of cash bail is to make sure a person comes back to court. If we have other concerns about public safety, we have mechanisms for doing that. And it's not using cash and creating a wealth-based detention system that keeps our poor neighbors, Black neighbors, brown neighbors locked up while others have the chance to purchase their freedom. What it also does, and an important thing, but a little bit more wonky, so I'll mention it without getting too far into it, is it takes that authority of setting the procedure for bail away from our state Supreme Court, and it sets it into the hands of the legislature, which we know is in a remarkably partisan place that gives us issues like issue 1, and instead of good policy, like we see in House Bill 315 and Senate Bill 182. So,
well, thank you, Patrick. And I agree. As the ACLU of Ohio, we work very closely on bail reform, real bail reform, and issue 1 just does come off as a head scratcher because, as you said, there's no connection between increasing cash bail amounts and increasing public safety. And honestly, I think as you say, if issue 1 comes to pass, it's going to make it harder for individuals, and I think the real intent is to make it impossible, but at the bare minimum, it's going to make it harder for people to purchase their freedom before they're even convicted of a crime. And I just think that is a very dangerous proposition for a free country and a free state to have in its constitution. But I did want to get to this, the other twist that's in this saga, which is this bipartisan legislation that you mentioned and which you've been following very closely. Can you talk about kind of the difference between issue 1 and the bipartisan legislation that's in front of the General Assembly currently?
Sure. So, yes, the coalition that's formed around issue 1, you'll notice today, if any of you follow us on social media, that ACLU of Ohio, as well as the Bail Project, have publicly announced our opposition to issue 1. And I trust that you'll be seeing and hearing more from a number of the other organizations around the state as well. But what you'll also see is a even broader coalition of folks who support this proposed system that you'll see on the right-hand side of the screen in House Bill 315 and Senate Bill 182. It's a coalition of people that includes faith groups, policy people, lawyers, judges even, directly impacted people at the front of the charge, sharing their stories of why this is so important. And so, you'll notice that, our criminal legal system is remarkably complicated, and this is a simplification. But in its simplest form, what this proposed system does in the legislation that, again, has been sitting in our legislature since May of 2021, is it switches that question of, do you have enough money to purchase your freedom, to, are you a flight risk? Are you a risk to the community? And it really equips courts, judges, and everyone involved in this process with the tools they need to promote public safety while also honoring the presumption of innocence that is so critical to this system. And so, very basically, and we can stay on this slide for just one more minute, is there's presumed release for people who are arrested and accused of crimes in the system. If that person is navigating the system and the judge or prosecutor says, wait a second, we don't want to presume release, we have concern about flight risk, public safety, either the judge or the prosecutor can request a hearing at which conditions can be placed on the person's release, or they can request a hearing if a person's accused of certain crimes to deny that person bail and keep them locked up pre-trial. We think this is a much fairer system. We think this is a system that does not yield wealth-based detention in a way that I described earlier. And so you'll see a little bit more of the list of organizations that I described before. It is a broad spectrum. We've got conservative think tanks. We've got progressive think tanks. We've got folks working, navigating the bail system with individual people facing cases. We've got OOC, Organizing Collaborative, and folks that really come from all different angles approaching this and support this and have done so since that May 2021 date. So the other thing that I think is important to note is just plugging the thousands of people around the state that are part of the action teams with ACLU of Ohio, people who are organizing locally in their communities, know their judges, know their prosecutors, and really have an ear to the ground in a way that those of us walking at the state hall or walking the halls of the state house do not. So huge shout out to those people that make my job much easier to do because they're really putting in the groundwork. So yeah, so just getting in briefly, I've covered some of this already, but what the legislation, again, House Bill 315 and Senate Bill 182 will accomplish is, we believe and we know based on some studies that I'll mention later, that this will reduce that 12,000 person sitting pretrial in an Ohio jail population. We know that it's going to go to significant lengths to end wealth-based detention in the state. We also know that, in this space where we're playing tug of war with people who are saying we need issue 1 for public safety, we know that we've got the facts and the data and the law on our side. We know that House Bill 315 and Senate Bill 182 promote public safety in a way that issue 1 never could. We also know that it strengthens our communities and saves our state a remarkable amount of money. Our criminal legal system is expensive, and I think it's time that we really, really consider moving beyond the status quo and not keeping people locked up based on the size of their bank account. And so lastly, I promised just a little bit of data and something that I hope this is more visibly friendly than what I had on the screen before. But we did have the chance to do some polling when this legislation came back out. We know that Ohioans support the need for true bail reform in Ohio. We know that we know that Ohioans reject wealth-based detention, not only because it's unconstitutional, but because it's unfair. Lastly, and you'll see on the right-hand side of the screen there, we conducted a fiscal impact analysis that found, based on some studies around the state, that there could be a significant amount of money saved by individual counties in their jails that could be reinvested into other things like making sure people have the supports they need through the pretrial process rather than keeping them in a jail cell. So with that, I will wrap up, but appreciate everyone hearing me out on this, and I'm happy to answer questions later on.
Well, thank you so much, Patrick. And I I think it's fair to say that the real solutions for bail reform and for making our pretrial legal system fairer while still increasing public safety lie in House Bill 315 and Senate Bill 182, and not issue one. To me, it seems that issue one is really is all politics and buzzwords. And speaking of politics and buzzwords, at the beginning of this segment, I mentioned that there were two constitutional amendments that voters will be deciding this November. We just heard about issue one, and there's also going to be issue two, which would prohibit non-citizens from voting in local elections. And if you're sitting at home thinking to yourself, well, don't you already have to be a citizen to vote in Ohio? You would be correct. However, that didn't stop the General Assembly from proposing this constitutional amendment anyway, regardless that federal and Ohio law already require citizenship in order to vote. So why would they do that? Well, in my opinion, it's all politics and buzzwords. Now, I want to move to questions from the audience, but before I do, if anybody out here there is interested in learning more about issue two, I wrote a blog post about it, about its flawed premise and its dangerous implications back when the General Assembly initially passed it. So please, if you are interested in learning more about it, I encourage you to read that blog post, and we'll drop that link in the chat. So now let's bring all the panelists back. That way we can get to some audience questions. And first of all, thank you all so much for lending us your expertise and your perspective on these critically important issues. Now, I just want to let folks know there are a lot of questions that have been posed. I can't promise that we're going to get to all of them. However, there was one question that was kind of the repeat customer, and Cynthia, this goes to you. A lot of people are very shocked to hear what all has been going on at the State Board of Education, and they have a desire to learn more about the candidates, but they're having trouble finding information. Can you point these folks into in the right direction to get some of this information on candidates?
Happy to, yes. First, I need to stress that the coalition, we do not endorse or oppose any candidates. We're nonpartisan, and even for candidates that are nonpartisan, we don't push candidates. But I can tell you where to find that information. So a few phenomenal resources is League of Women Voters Ohio. We have two resources. One is called vote411.org, which is a comprehensive way to get election information, to look up candidate responses to questions, and the responses from the candidates are unedited, so you get to see and read what they pose. We leave the typos in too. And then, so that's digital. And then we also have a print guide, which gets distributed through major newspapers around the state as well. So definitely keep your eye out for that. I also encourage you to head over to ACLU Ohio's site as well. They are building out phenomenal resources. They have this great page that actually teaches you about the positions, the elected positions, so that you understand the power that's involved in those seats, and then also creating essentially like dossiers or fact sheets about the candidates as well. And they'll also be providing those around the State Board of Education. One more place that I'll tell you to look is Morgan Trow with WEWS. She's doing a series right now about State Board of Education, and she just dropped her her first report last night about the candidates in District 10. So I encourage you to Google that. I think we have a link for that as well. And then we've got another intrepid reporter, Laura Hancock, Cleveland.com and Plain Deal, and she does incredible reporting around the State Board as well.
Well, thank you, Cynthia, and you're right. The ACLU, I know the league through their Vote 411 has a lot of resources. The ACLU will be launching our State Board of Education Power of series, I believe next week. So make sure to tune in for when that goes live. We'll make sure to have that up on our website as well as our social media channels. And again, thank you, Cynthia, for raising this to everybody's attention. I'm so happy that folks are starting to get motivated for voting in these elections. They're just so important. Patrick, this next question is to you. I think what you had to say about, issue one kind of, forcing Ohio backwards in our reliance on cash bail, that kind of struck a nerve, I think, with some folks in the audience. One question is asking, does issue one effectively just amount to a handout or support to the bail industry in our state?
I think that's a fair way to look at it. It's something that when the Supreme Court in DuBois v. McGuffey, that case that I mentioned before, that decision took away a tool and a toolkit that never should have been there. But that's a tool that propped up this wealth-based detention system where folks had to rely on the bail industry to pay for their freedom in a way that they never should have to begin with. So, I do think that is fair. And public safety is such a nebulous concept. It's based on fear mongering rather than what people in our communities need. Because we get safer when people can go back to their jobs, back to their families, can pick up their kids from school. And we don't get safer by, using cash bail as a proxy for public safety. So, it's a great step backwards, especially in light of the fact that we've got something better that promotes public safety that's been sitting in our legislature for so long.
So, Patrick, real quick, another follow-up. There was a question about, there's been bail reform efforts in other states, and we see headlines all the time, kind of inflammatory headlines that, bail reform has failed. Can you talk about how, House Bill 315, Senate Bill 182, how those are different from those other state, bail reform measures and what Ohio is doing, especially this bipartisan coalition, to find that balance between, the presumption of innocence that we hold so dear in a free society and, public safety, making sure our streets are safe?
Certainly, yes. And just want to make sure I uplift that concern. I think everyone wants to feel safe in their communities, in their homes, wherever they are. I think we need to think about public safety as a much bigger picture than just what, I think I saw a comment before about, be afraid of your shadow when you step out of your house. There's a lot bigger meaning to public safety. And so, I think the legislation, again, Senate Bill 182, House Bill 315, is a meeting of the minds of lots of different people because of years and years and years of work. And so not only have we learned from the other states and cities around the country who have taken their try at bail reform, but we've learned and really looked at, when I say we, I mean the global we of all the advocates working in this space. We know how bail works in our state. We know how it has worked elsewhere and has not worked elsewhere. And there are parts of this bill that different groups, like more than others. And so this is truly a meeting of the minds that has the right toolkit. That this is not a total removal of the cash bail system. It still remains in the judge's toolkit. But what it does is it equips courts with the tools they need to protect public safety while also making sure that we're not jailing those 12,000 people unnecessarily in the name of public safety. Again, keeping in mind that much bigger picture of what public safety actually means to the people who are navigating our pretrial system.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that and clearing that up. I think it's just so important that people do know this is an Ohio bill with Ohio solutions. So thank you for really drilling down to that distinction. Akii, there's been a bunch of questions coming in related to the redistricting mess that we have all had to struggle through for close to 18 months now. And though the onus that tonight's program has been on the Ohio Supreme Court's role in redistricting, there are still some questions out there about what the redistricting saga means for competitive state house and state senate elections. Can you talk to us a little bit about how the map that's enacted, even though it was declared unconstitutional by the Ohio Supreme Court, can you talk to us about how some of our elections are going to be a little different this year as opposed to pre-redistricting in 2021?
Absolutely, yeah. Sorry about that. So as we stated before, redistricting in Ohio has been a hot mess. The maps that we have been given have been just not it, very much gerrymandering, even though they like to say, oh, it's not gerrymandering. I mean, the Supreme Court struck them down. Like, it's the Supreme Court upholding the Constitution. So when I think about the different elections going on in terms of sort of like our like House and Senate and things of that nature, I want to say I feel like all of the elections are sort of important. All the races are very important. As we stated before, redistricting has been such a hot mess that we didn't just have one primary this year. We had two primaries. We had two, which changed the landscape for a lot of things. Not only that, but when it comes to drawing the districts, we know that Ohio actually lost a seat. We actually lost a seat this year. And so with us losing the seat, with the redistricting happening, how it's been happening, and with the overall confusion over our state maps in general, as well as just these elections, I would say like every race is sort of important. There are many people who are probably going to be presiding over districts that have never even lived in that district or are nowhere near that district. Probably don't know anything about that district. So I would say it is very important for you to go and do your research, and that's like super easy. One of the things I would suggest doing would like first look up the district that you're in, figure out what your district is, and you can do that by going to like findmydistrict.ohio. I think it's Ohio sos.gov. You can use that. That's a good way to sort of like, find your district and see where you're at. And then also look up like the different candidates to see like, again, do they actually live in that district? Have they ever lived in that district? And also discover how your district has changed, because many districts, the way they've been drawn, have either gone into new territory. So there are people who probably think, hey, I'm this district with that, but the whole time now you're in a whole separate district with different people, with a different representative you don't even know. So essentially the redistricting has completely just altered the way we are going to vote in these, like the way we voted already in these upcoming elections, and the way we will be voting come November. And again, that's why I said our best line of defense. When you're out doing that, voting for your representatives and doing your information research on that, make sure you do the same for the Supreme Court, because at the end of the day, we're gonna need a Supreme Court in order to save like the actual and true redistricting process from what it has become, sadly, in our great state.
Yeah. Well, yeah, Akii, I totally agree with you. Now, this is going to be our last follow-up. We're running a little short on time, and I want to save some time for the end for you all to tell us about some exciting opportunities to get involved. But there was a couple, one item I wanted to touch on, Akii. A lot of people in Ohio have been, understandably and justifiably incredibly frustrated with our redistricting mess that we've had, our hot mess, as you said it. Now, and part of that frustration is being directed towards the Ohio Supreme Court, because in our new amendments that were passed in 2015 and 2018, the court can only invalidate a map. They can't create one on their own. That responsibility lies with the Ohio Redistricting Commission and the General Assembly. Now, we're talking state elections here, so I'll only talk about the Ohio Redistricting Commission, but how can folks cast a meaningful vote to change the makeup of the Ohio Redistricting Commission? The ones who actually draw the maps in the first place. That's made up of the governor, the auditor, the secretary of state, and 4 legislative leaders. What would you say to people that, don't even want to leave it to the Ohio Supreme Court? They want fair maps in the first place. What would you say to that person?
First thing I would say is, again, go out and vote. As we stated, some of these folks are up for re-election this year. Hint, Governor DeWine. So he's up for election this year. And he's somebody that, at the many, many testimonies for like, the redistricting and different things of that nature, someone that we've said, hey, like, We want fair maps. The people are asking for fair maps. They've shown up. They've drawn maps. They've turned out to get signatures for petitions to create these amendments so that you guys would have a transparent and a real process. So I would say for that, just to make sure you can, like, if you want to do, if you want to cast a meaningful vote and make sure that vote counts, make sure you know exactly the folks that are running and make sure you know what positions they have. Because again, Governor DeWine is not the only one who is running that is a part of that commission. And not the only person that's running that has a say in what goes on within our great state here in Ohio. So I would say do your research, make sure you make the best decision for you, and continue to push on them and call them out.
Well, thank you for that, Akii. That was as cordial as a recap as I think the Ohio Redistricting Commission deserves for their performance this year. But thank you all for all the panelists answering those questions. And again, we're coming to the close of tonight's program. But before we do, I always want to save space for members of our panel who are given their time tonight to make sure that they have an opportunity to tell the audience, tell you folks what they have coming up next, opportunities for you to get plugged in, whether it be just following on social media or attending a rally. No action is too big or too small. So, Cynthia, I'm going to start with you. What's up next for the Honesty for Ohio Education Coalition?
Yeah, well, first of all, I encourage everyone to get involved with the coalition and actually take action. If we jump to the next slide, you'll see several different ways you can take action. Number one is voting. Thank you, Akii, for drilling that in. Pay attention to what's happening at the State House. We have a lot of educational gag orders 3 there. Pay attention to the State Board of Education, of course. Watch or attend the September 19th and 20th meeting. You'd be surprised about what happens in the dialogue that actually happens there, and always pay attention to your school districts, attend those school board meetings, engage with your administrators, with your superintendent and your school board. A lot of these resolutions can pass under the radar because people aren't paying attention. Here are a couple of different ways you can plug into the coalition. Our website, please join the mailing list. It's the best way to keep up on all of these, moving targets in the State House and the State Board. Follow us on social media, traditional platforms, Insta, Facebook, and Twitter. And then some upcoming events for you all. So our education exchange is next week, and we're going to unpack social emotional learning. There's a lot of controversy swimming around about what it is, what it isn't. We're going to demystify it. We're going to connect it to some actual hard data that's been released about our students, how they're faring across the state. Please attend and mark your calendars for Saturday, September 17th. We're having a massive statewide rally at the State House. We're all meeting at the intersection of education and democracy, and really talking about why we need to be at the ballots to save the future of education. We have an incredible lineup of speakers, calling out ACLU Ohio, again, talking about student rights. Sean McCann is going to be there. Akii Butler will be there, a whole host of other folks. You don't want to miss it. And then one more plug there for State Board of Education, and then just a bunch of resources for you to dive into just to learn more about what we do in our house at Honesty for Ohio Education. Thanks so much, Collin.
Well, no, thank you, Cynthia. Again, amazing stuff. And thank you so much for spending time with us tonight. Akii, what's up next for the Ohio Student Association? How can folks plug in and speak out? I think you're on mute.
Not me being muted. Yikes. Okay, great. But thank you so much for asking us. So ways to stay in the loop, of course, we have our website. You can always visit us at ohiostudentassociation.org. There you can figure out how to get involved, even maybe create a chapter on your own college campus, or get involved on a chapter that's currently on your campus. And we also have our Twitter, our Instagram, and our Facebook. Also, as Cynthia mentioned, we will also be at the State House on the 17th at that rally, because we want to make sure that we protect an honest education. Like Cynthia said, this is an extremely important rally. These bills not only affect grades K through 12, but some of the bills also affect higher education and even political subdivisions and state agencies. So we would really love for you guys to be there. And also, besides that, what's going on, as some of you may not know, OSA is actually like a nice little branch of the Ohio Organizing Collaborative. And one of the cool things we actually have going on there is we're doing a training there around this power mapping the state Supreme Court. So when it comes to that, that is going to be a September training that is on September 13th and September 15th from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. It is a two-part training series. It was with Repower, Ohio Organizing Collaborative, and the Buckeye Justice Forum. And it's basically a virtual training, which is going to be on Zoom. It's a virtual training that you can go to that will allow you to actually learn how to organize around the Supreme Court and make sure you get the wins and get the Supreme Court that you would actually love to see. One that actually supports its citizens instead of, not supporting its citizens. And we actually have a registration link right here that I'm actually going to drop into the chat for you guys.
Well, thank you so much, Akii. I just want to give you and the entire OSA, props. I think focusing and activating our young people in this state is just such a great energizer for me. Our students are our future, and I know our future's in good hands with folks like you and OSA leading the way. And last but not least, Patrick, why don't you go ahead and tell folks how they can get involved with the ACLU of Ohio?
Yes, of course. I trust that folks who are already here tonight, or at least I hope, are following us across social media as well. But you'll see there, we've got a number of different places you can plug into the work that we're doing. So please check out our action teams. I mentioned before, we rely on our action teams to get that ear to the ground kind of knowledge of what's going on around the state. We have a listening campaign going on right now. We're hoping to hear from thousands of people around the state about what issues matter to them, so it can guide our work going into the future. We want to hear from real people and not the echo chamber of the state house and what's going on in policy world. So tell us what matters to you. Take that survey. It's quick and worth your time. Sign up to receive our action alerts. Like other folks have already mentioned, there is going to be a lot happening at the State House as the legislature gets back to work this fall. There are going to be things moving quickly, and we would love to get in contact with you quickly and get you in touch with the folks who should be hearing from you throughout that process. And lastly, as always, check out our page of ways to other get involved, whether it's through donation of your time, money, what have you. Whatever support you can throw down, it's needed as we tackle bail reform and other issues at the State House. So I'll stop there. Collin, back to you.
Well, absolutely. And again, one final thank you to our amazing panelists. Thank you so much for offering your insights, your perspective on these key issues, key races. I think we're all better having heard it tonight. I love these events. You get in the weeds and some of the stuff that you don't typically hear about on the news. And I always love, really digging in. I think tonight's theme in a nutshell is elections matter. All elections matter. So please go find out what's going to be on your ballot, especially all the way down, because those races are just as important. And finally, one final thank you to you, the audience. Thank you very much for being here and sharing your evening with us tonight. Without you, we're just four people talking into our computer screens. So you really make it all worth it. So again, we are on the clock. Election day is rapidly approaching, but not only election day, but the voter registration deadline is rapidly approaching. We are 33 days away. So please go online, check your voter registration status. You can go do that at the Secretary of State's website. You can do that on the ACLU of Ohio's website. And we urge you to get your voting plan together because November will be here before you know it. So again, thank you very much, everybody. It was a pleasure to be here with you all this evening. Take care and have a great rest of your night.